33rd Annual State of Logistics Report has just been issued. It's conducted by Kearney, the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals, and Penske Logistics. And I'm joined today by Kearney partner Michael Zimmerman to talk to us about some of the highlights of that new study. Hello, Michael.
Good afternoon. Hello.
So you've been doing this for a while.
This is our 7th year, yes.
You got a lot under your belt and a lot of knowledge about what the industry's been doing all these years. What is it about this one, this time around? Anything in particular that surprised you or was especially notable in the conclusions that you drew this year?
Yeah, that's almost an easy one because basically logisticians are recovering from the worst conditions in history. So if you think of how supply chains have been buffeted by the pandemic and then the stimulus that followed, it was really the bullwhip effect on steroids and adrenaline at the same time. And that means that a lot of lessons have been learned. And I think what makes it particularly exciting this time around is that most shippers, most international supply chains are completely rethinking how they should design their supply chains going forward. So there's going to be a lot of energy, a lot of innovation, more risk-taking, I think, in this space than we've seen in the past.
Interesting. Well, we like to think that out of pain comes wisdom and experience, and you seem to suggest that, in fact, companies are using this crisis to move forward in a better way. But what do you mean about the risk aspect of it? What are you talking about?
Well, so for example, the emphasis in supply chains, I would say over the last 20 years has been about just in time, about being lean, about making things happen with a minimal amount of investment and waste. And what we found is that those supply chains that had been designed in that way were fragile. They broke easily. It could have been a tsunami, an earthquake, a trade dispute, a war. So the risk-taking is going to be around building greater options, looking for more options in the supply chain, diversifying away from China, for example, for imports, going to Cambodia, to Thailand, to Vietnam, to India, to Mexico. But setting up those options is more costly than single sourcing to a highly efficient, low-cost producer. So that process involves taking risks, investing and exploring new supply markets, new suppliers, new logistical routes, investing in redundant capacity, perhaps extra inventory. So all this diversification of options and exploring and creating more optionality creates risk, creates cost in supply chains.
Yeah, I imagine it would be an exaggeration to say that just-in-time or JIT is dead. You still want to control costs, you still want to minimize inventory, but you do find that companies are willing to sit on with more inventory on their books or on somebody's books, ready to be employed at a moment's notice if needed, right?
Yes, and it's not just the inventory, but let's just call it reserve capacity. So I guess the most obvious reserve capacity is inventory of stuff that you can sell, but then it can be reserve capacity with a manufacturer who may be able to supply something for you, but eventually they're going to need orders or they're going to need some compensation for holding that capacity for you. From logistics provider, whether it's ships or planes or trucks, being ready with alternative sources of supply and then the means to transport them means making new commitments perhaps that you haven't made before to carriers or to suppliers. So we're back into that risk and investment space.
We heard before the pandemic even came upon us that companies were already thinking twice about their China sourcing strategies. Number one, the logistics of moving stuff over great distances was quite expensive, they learned, in terms of total cost of goods sold. Also the idea that Chinese labor was getting more expensive back then. So not a completely new trend, but accelerated now, you think?
Certainly an accelerant, a catalyst. Basically, because the Chinese capabilities, education level, infrastructure, advanced markets, advanced supply chains, they were pretty much the low-cost producer at a very industrial scale, to say the least. So it's one thing to talk about change, but then when you start looking at the alternative costs and the alternative risks of other supply chains, of other supply markets, the movement was fairly slow. In fact, Kearney has a reshoring report where we've explored this theme for about 7 or 8 years. And we found through that study that you had words and then you had actions, and the actions were much slower to follow through than the expectations that nearshoring or reshoring would happen. Now, what happened with COVID, of course, is that it really acted as an accelerant, as a disruptor at the same time to say, there may be even more risk in not taking action. Let's say that disputes with China intensify. Look what happened with Russia. They're cutting off Europe of energy supplies.
Yeah.
So that very capacity that you depend on becomes a weakness in times of tension.
Yeah,
and multinational firms and their supply chains see that weakness and want to start dealing with it better.
And if we lose Taiwan as a source of microprocessors, we're in trouble.
Well, that's an understatement, because if we lose that, it probably means that a much greater piece has been lost, and there's going to be a resetting of global political economy alignment.
For sure. Now, you talked about alternatives to China. The immediate things that you said were basically Southeast Asia and India.
Yeah.
You mentioned Mexico also, but then you're talking about the reshoring study. Do you define the word reshoring as meaning coming back to the United States?
Well, I mean, then it would be re-Americanizing.
Okay. So there is a distinction there.
Yeah. So I mean, if you look at it very literally, the idea, offshoring was taking it off our shores, reshoring is bringing it back to our shores.
Right.
But then you think of our shores, maybe it's NAFTA. What we're going to see and what we are seeing is more investment of time and money in reshoring, both into NAFTA and into the United States.
Yeah.
But it's going to take a while. I think one of the things that might help is automation, in the sense that one of the advantages that China and Southeast Asia had over the US markets were much lower labor costs and a pretty skilled labor force. If you can start reshoring industries where automation has a significant role, certainly microprocessors is a space that has a lot of automation, but there are plenty of others, then that advantage of the labor cost differential shrinks, and reshoring makes more sense.
Once you put up $2 or $3 billion to build a fab in the United States,
exactly.
then you're home free.
Exactly.
in terms of the cost. So ESG, the environment, sustainability, does that pop up in the responses more this year than it has in the past?
Yeah, very much so. I see that the actions are catching up to the words here, and corporations absolutely want to do the right thing. They want also to appear to do the right thing, and that means that you need to follow through. There's been a lot of talk about greenwashing and making superficial efforts at ESG, but I would say in the supply chain space, and especially in logistics, executives and people in the trenches working day to day are looking for ways to make the E part, for example, environmental carbon footprint reduction, a reality. And at a base level, any logistics optimization project is going to reduce your company's carbon footprint. So in a certain sense, logisticians should be taking credit for what they're doing already. But then the next level, where you need to spend something extra, electric vehicles cost more, high efficiency vehicles cost more, collaborating with your supply chain partners to create backhauls and investing in that, those things cost more. I think once they get the easy wins that come from the free E, it's going to be about the invest in E, and I think that is starting to happen more.
And here again, we talk about the concept of reshoring, which by definition probably means the shortening of supply lines, at least in certain cases, which would automatically lead to a better ESG performance, because the logistics aspect, as you say, logistics optimization aspect is cheaper, right?
True.
So that's a good thing. Maybe it comes automatically. And so do you think it truly is realistic for like major manufacturers to diversify geographically their supplier base, to have one supplier in China maybe, but to have a B supplier in another continent entirely? That's an expensive proposition. Necessary in terms of interruption of supply though? Are companies really committed to that concept going forward?
They are committing, they have to. So they're exploring it, and some of them are doing it. I mean, our clients are the Fortune 500, the Fortune 1000, and we are absolutely advising them in this space. They are already doing it, they have been doing it, but it's a question of degree. If you are a very large supplier of home products or furnishings or carpeting or flooring, if you were single sourcing in China, you are absolutely now looking for, or have already started, alternative sources of supply. But maybe, whereas before you might have been 90% sourced in China, now you've added another 5 or 10% in these other countries, but you haven't taken all of your chips and moved them out of China. That is not by any means happened. But you're certainly taking some of those chips and placing them elsewhere.
But even if you're doing that, you're not doing it tomorrow. I mean, it takes a while to.
Well, some are doing it today.
Are they real? I mean, they can do that fast. They can change their supplier.
It's a long process, so
Yeah.
it's not like you don't build a factory in a couple of years. In some cases, maybe
Yeah.
that's probably the shortest lead time. But what you start to do is you start to talk to the supply base. You start talking about the commitment levels that are needed. You start doing due diligence on the capabilities. You're walking their factories. You're doing assessments of them. Maybe you work with them, you talk about what expansion looks like. All of those conversations are happening, and in some cases they pulled the trigger on it. You used to assemble something in China, now you're going to be assembling the materials and assembling it in Mexico, for example.
Yeah.
Or you might split that assembly, keep doing some of it in China and then do some of it in Mexico, and then bring some of the automated stuff into the United States. So that is happening now. But I do agree with you that the big moves, pulling out of a factory 50% of your production in China and moving it elsewhere, that takes longer.
Yeah. Talk about a paradigm shift. This is amazing.
Indeed.
I mean, if you really want to get a portrait of what the logistics and supply chain industry has gone through in the last 2 or 3 years, I don't think there's a better document to read than this, the 33rd Annual State of Logistics Report. Thank you so much for helping us understand once again. Kearney, Penske Logistics, CSCMP. Michael, thank you very much for being with me to talk about it.
My pleasure, and thank you to your audience as well.
I've been speaking with Michael Zimmerman of Kearney. Thank you very much for watching.